Hello, my name is Tennyson E. Stead. I am a working screenwriter, I am a working script doctor, and welcome to The Right Stuff. This episode is the first in a 6-part series on finishing the pilot script and the show Bible for your 60-minute dramatic television series. Regardless of the genre that we're working in, any 60-minute show is going to be a drama. A lot of writers are going to tell you that in the era of streaming, the creative floodgates have opened and that production companies are no longer bound by the confines of television and network distribution. You don't have to fit into the same boxes that the advertisers needed you to fit into. Your show doesn't need to be a certain length so that it fits into a television schedule. Those things are true. But those are not the only reasons why a 30-minute show is either a comedy or an animated series, whereas a 60-minute show is a drama of some kind. That's not the only reason. Generally speaking, production constraints are the primary reason. If you're going to shoot a comedy, you're going to need a lot of rehearsal time on set. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. Most of the time in production, comedy has a lot to do with trial and error. You've built a very funny cast. They're going to try experimenting with things. And even in the era of streaming, they only want to spend so much money to get each episode of television out to the audience. So if you have an hour of, finished television production that you need to deliver on the end of any given week, you have got to make sure that you are not wasting time on set. And comedy is all about wasting time on set. You can't get around it. With animation, it's the same story. The production is the reason. Animation is always expensive. Even if we're talking about Family Guy, even if we're talking about South Park, regardless of the production plan, there's no way to make animation anything less than the most expensive kind of television production. All you can hope for by constraining the style of any given show to something that doesn't require as much effort and attention, all you can really hope for is to make the show achievable. You're never going to make it cheap. And, this is me coming to you with 10 years of animation experience. If you think that I can say it's very understandable to want to believe that technology has somehow made animation accessible in some kind of egalitarian way, and that the creativity behind the animation process is becoming somehow more fluid and more freeform and less planned out and less deliberate, and that it allows for more experimentation as time goes on. And unless we're talking about AI, it's simply not true. If we are talking about AI, that's a whole nother conversation for another day, but the reason why it takes less time is because you're stealing the work of other animators. That's the reason. I'm not going to argue about the ethics of doing so, but that's why it doesn't take as much effort from you. So for all of these reasons, a 60-minute show, whether it takes place in the FBI, whether it takes place in a restaurant kitchen, whether it takes place anywhere else, it's a drama, okay? And by the way, if you haven't seen Prelude, the most important and elusive fundamental in screenwriting, if you haven't watched the video that says "Watch Me First" in the classroom section of this webpage, please do that, because that's going to give us a very common vocabulary for talking about structure. There's 2 parts to delivering a show to somebody who wants to read it. There's the pilot script, which is the screenplay for the first episode of the show. That's half the work. The other half is the show Bible. What is a show Bible? A show Bible is a 5 or 6 page document that reads people initially into the conversation of the show. The word Bible is a little bit misleading because it sort of implies that you want to put everything in there. You don't. The point of the show Bible is not to make the reader as educated as possible about the show. The point of the Bible is to slap it in the hands of an executive 3 minutes before they walk into a meeting with you, so that they can flip through the pages in front of them and understand on the most basic level what the show is and how it's relevant to their network or their streaming service or whatever it is that they do. So for this reason, we're not going to spend a lot of time exploring all the elements of world building. We're not going to try and pack in every single character that's in the show. We're not going to sit here and have a discourse, a 5-page paper about the sociological impact of the show that we're trying to make. None of that goes in the show Bible. Okay? I'm not saying it's not important to write these things down. It absolutely is. There's a lot of different information that you're going to need to share as a writer or a showrunner over the course of the show's production. You should certainly be keeping a binder full of information about how the show works and why the show works and what's going into it. All of that work at some point is going to be useful to somebody. You want to make sure that you have it on hand when it's required. Do not put it in this document. This document needs to be a quick, easy brief on how to understand the show on its most basic level. And there's a couple of elements that are expected to be there. So let's talk about those. So the first thing that we're going to put in this document is the pitch. The pitch is the reason for making the show. You want to keep the pitch down, if possible, to 2 paragraphs, a setup and a payoff. And you want each of those paragraphs to be 3 sentences long. I'm not saying, by the way, that you need to write all this stuff in this first week. We're just explaining what a show Bible is. We're going to deal with the show Bible in its entirety in episode 6. I'm just going to give you this information up front so you know what to expect. And if anything occurs to you over the course of the next 6 weeks to write down, you should probably write it down. There's parts of the show Bible that we need to do up front. We're going to address those more specifically as we go on with the episode. So the pitch. It's 2 paragraphs. It's 3 sentences each. The first part is, why is this show necessary? And the second part is, how does this show satisfy the necessity? That's it. A log line. Any writer who's working in screenwriting should know what a log line is. If you don't, it is 1 sentence that describes the action of the show in a compelling way. What is the show about? In the sense of what is the protagonist trying to do? What is the object and what is the verb of the show? And what is the stakes? A tagline. A tagline is the thing a lot of writers think they're supposed to be writing when they write a log line. It's something clever and quippy that you're going to say about your show in order to make people want to watch it. You're going to put it right there on the front of your show Bible, so please make sure it is engaging. A lot of the time it's as simple as asking the question that's posed by the show's themes. You know, a show about a robot trying to become a man, and you can just say, what does it mean to be human, kind of thing. And I'm sure they'll reinvent their own marketing plan for the show, so please don't be attached to anything that you put there. It's just a question of giving people a taste of what the show's marketing is going to look like. Comparables. Don't argue with me about whether or not it's distasteful. Just find 2 shows, at least, that a marketing person can use to assure themselves that this show doesn't exist in a cultural vacuum. That's it. The synopsis. And the synopsis is 4 paragraphs at most, 3 sentences each, breaking down the story of the first season of television. That season is going to be 8 episodes altogether because this is the age of streaming and because you're writing a dramatic series and because we're all unestablished writers here. So, put down the wings, Icarus. 8 episodes. Okay? And I know that's going to seem restrictive. A lot of writers have sent me show Bibles with pages of season synopsis included. And again, you can't read that in 2 minutes walking into a meeting. You're just going to set it aside and accept that you don't know what you're talking about. And if you run the studio and you already feel lost in the show, it's our job to make sure that any executives, any producers, any actors, anybody who's walking into the room to talk with each other, not necessarily just with us, about this show, has all the information they need to have a basic, intelligent conversation about what's involved as quickly as possible. If we can't do that, then we're not the writer for the show. So don't try to cram as much information as possible into the heads of the readers. You're not trying to impress these people with how much you know about your television show. They've met writers before. What they need to see is just enough information to have an intelligent discussion about how this show impacts their future and the futures of anyone that they represent and the futures of anybody who works for them. That's it. So that's the synopsis. Character breakdowns are basically for casting purposes, okay? And you're going to look at these characters visually on the page the same way you would see them in any other production environment. You're going to start with the character's name in all caps, and then after that, in parentheses, you're going to put their age, any demographics that they represent that are important in casting, including gender, racial identifiers that they may possess, whether or not they're binary or mixed or non or whatever the case may be. Make sure that anything that affects casting in any way is in there. Always, I encourage you to specifically cast away from white male actors as much as possible, because the default is always going to be to cast white and it's always going to be to cast male. So if you want to see representation as a writer, you actually have to fight for it. Take that initiative with every single character that you write, because there's going to be pushback every single time. Once you have those identifiers, you write a 1 to 2 sentence biography of who that character is relative to the story. How do they relate to the protagonist? What are they doing to affect the story? Once your character breakdowns are done, then you have a pilot summary. A pilot summary is a 4-paragraph breakdown. Again, no more than 3 sentences per paragraph on the story of the pilot episode. And we're going to get into that structurally after we do the episode breakdown. So we're going to start big. We're going to work our way small. Okay? And then after that, you do the episode breakdown. You've got 8 episodes of television. The first one was the pilot summary, so you have 7 more episodes to break down. We're going to build an arc for that in just a minute. After you do the episode breakdown, you're going to do future seasons. You're going to write 1 paragraph on what season 2 of this show is about, in terms of what the protagonist of the show is doing to drive the action of the story and the conflict of the story forward. And then you're going to do 1 paragraph, and you're going to label these season 2 and season 3. You're going to write 1 paragraph on what the protagonist of the show is doing in season 3 to drive the action and the conflict of the story forward. That is the end of your show Bible. You really don't want more than that in there. Okay? We're keeping these things as brief as we possibly can because we want this information to be concise and accessible to anybody who's trying to enter the conversation. Do not try to make your reader an expert at any point in this process. We are trying to give every single person who touches this document a fast, layman's perspective on how this show actually works. If you've seen Prelude, the most elusive and important fundamental in screenwriting, if you've seen the video that I keep posting on this website that says, "Watch me first," that video, if you've seen it, you already know that a lot of really popular television shows, particularly from earlier in television's history, haven't done the things that I'm asking you to do. If you look back earlier, certainly, than the 2000s, if you look at 90s television, 80s television, 70s television, and back from there, what you're going to find is that most television is reactive. It's really the cinema that focuses on characters achieving goals. And of course, it's very easy to say, well, this classic television show or that classic television show didn't do the things that you're talking about, so I don't see why it's so important. And it's dramaturgically valid to sit here and have a conversation about how cinema came from the theater, essentially, and is the heir to the traditions of the theater, whereas television really did come from the radio. That's a valid conversation to have. The thing I want you to understand right now is that in the 90s and before, everybody knew that television was bad. We always gobbled up the best actors in Hollywood for movies. This is a complicated issue to discuss. I have a lot of personal friends who have worked in television during the eras that we're talking about, and they're proud of their work, and they absolutely should be. Television over the course of the last 5 decades has really built itself into a globally recognized artistic craft, to the point where now we're seeing the best television that's ever been produced, and we have been seeing systemically the best television that's ever been produced every single decade since the 70s. It's happened that every single generation of television producers is producing better television than the generation before it, and that's fantastic. We love to see that. But it does mean that looking back, things have been learned over the course of that process. Things have essentially been taken from cinema and by extension from theater and introduced into television. People are talking about how television is getting more and more cinematic over time. Well, that's deliberate. That's because we knew that it needed something more than what it had to stay competitive, particularly when you can stream any kind of entertainment that you want to. It's not going to serve you well if you deliver a show built on the same conventions as a show like X-Files or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because those conventions, in a lot of cases, were concessions to quality that at the time were a big step up from what had been produced beforehand. And in hindsight, in light of all the steps up that we've made since, seem not just evocative of a time and place, not just homage-like, but actually frustrating. Don't do it. So, when I ask, what is this show about? I am asking, what is the action of the protagonist in this show? What is the logline of the show that we are writing? Great stories on the stage and screen are made from the efforts of our characters to accomplish overwhelmingly challenging goals. So the one thing to consider as we figure out what this logline is and as we figure out what the goal of the protagonist really is, that it needs to be overwhelmingly challenging. It needs to be something that they are doomed to fail at, because then they need to keep trying. And because as they keep trying, they're going to have to find new ways of improving their efforts. They're going to have to grow and change, and they're going to force themselves to grow and change in order to accomplish the goal that they're trying to accomplish. You want a goal so far out of reach that this character is going to have to evolve and do amazing things and push and push and push. That's your logline. So, you figured out what the show's about. Now we need to break that down into seasons of television. I don't necessarily need you to know all 7 seasons of television here. You don't necessarily know how long this show is going to last. Okay? Your first season of television isn't about where the character winds up. Your first season of television is about your character doing the first thing that they really need to do in order to achieve their larger goal. They don't wind up there. They put themselves there. So what is that goal? What is your protagonist trying to achieve in the first season of this show? Don't make it something small. Do not worry about holding plot in reserve. If you feel like the end game of season 1 is going to achieve most of the work of accomplishing your character's larger goal over the course of the series, take a look at that larger goal and see if you're underselling it. What is the big picture of what they're trying to achieve? Don't let that live in the subtext of the story. Don't hint at it. Don't let them sort of thematically come by that achievement later in the story, or just realize, oh my gosh, look at everything we've accomplished. No, let them deliberately go after that. and let them use these other goals as waypoints in the achievement of that big picture effort. So, if being ambitious in season 1 with the characters' goals puts the squeeze on you in terms of the overall series, if you feel like, there's not a lot left to do in season 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, if you feel like you're running out of road, take a second now while the show's in its infancy. Look at your character's motivation. See if maybe there's more to it. So now you have the protagonist goal for season 1. We're going to break that goal down into 8 steps, 8 things that they absolutely need to do in order to achieve that goal. And the beautiful thing about an 8-episode season is that it's divisible by 4. So we're going to use the cinematic 3-act structure to support the arc of the overall series. Okay? Each 2 episodes represents basically an act break. The first 2 episodes of your show is going to lead you through Act 1 of your series, of your season. The second 2 episodes is going to lead you through the midpoint. The third 2 episodes is going to lead you through the second turning point. And the last 2 episodes are going to lead you through the ending of the season. All right? So what do these words mean? The beginning of any story involving actors is the first effort of the protagonist to achieve their goal. You're going to write this down. You're going to break this down for yourself. So the protagonist starts trying to achieve their goal. What's the first thing that they need to do? Now, over the course of the first act, your character is preparing to achieve their goal. That doesn't mean that things are being set up for them. It doesn't mean that plot is being organized. You're not setting up the chessboard. That's not how this works. Your protagonist is doing the work of ensuring their success once they start exposing themselves to the risks of whatever it is they're actually trying to do. Okay? So that's what's going to happen. Your first 2 episodes are going to be about your character undertaking their own preparations to make sure that they actually succeed in the goal that they're trying to succeed at, which in this case is the goal for the first season. So the end of Act 1 is that point where your protagonist has finished making their preparations and they actually expose themselves to the risks of whatever they're trying to do. So whatever it is that might go wrong, whatever it is that might blow up in their face, they are pushing that conflict now. They are escalating the conflict against anyone, who has an interest in stopping whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. Now, the midpoint of the show is that point where their protagonist pushes that conflict against the antagonist to the point where their goals are no longer sustainable. The antagonist has started throwing every possible resource and every possible effort at stopping the protagonist's goals because the protagonist has made it necessary to do so. And now the protagonist's life is turning upside down because whatever it is that they're trying to achieve was never going to be sustainable in the first place. The end of Act 2 is where the protagonist pushes their goal and their conflict to the point where this stock market bubble that they've been building, this catastrophe that they've been investing in because what they're trying to do is not sustainable, comes crashing down on them, and they destroy all the resources and they destroy all the support networks that they had. And in the emptiness of that wreckage, they have to find a new way forward for themselves. So, your first 2 episodes are about the 2 things your protagonist really needs to do in order to finish their preparations and engage the risk of what they're trying to accomplish head on. What are the 2 big things that they have to do to achieve that goal? Those are log lines for episodes. You see how that works? Each of those things that they have to do is something that you can break down into acts. You can break those things down into smaller steps and tell the story of how the protagonist did those things. So each of those things the protagonist has to do in order to finish their preparations becomes an episode, so long as those 2 things are challenging enough and require enough effort from the protagonist that they're going to have to learn and grow dramatically in the process, so long as those 2 things are overwhelmingly challenging. Then, once you've figured out what those 2 things are, you list the 2 things that your protagonist has to do to push their conflict engage the risk of what they're trying to do and push that conflict so hard and so far that it starts to collapse in on them. Those two things are episodes 3 and 4 of your show. Episodes 5 and 6 are what your protagonist does to keep that conflict moving forward once they start overextending themselves visibly. Whether it's unconscious or conscious, once they start realizing that this is not working and that it's not going to work, what are the two biggest things that they do to make sure that it works, even though it obviously won't? That's episodes 5 and 6. Episode 7 is about how they find a new way forward. What do they do to find a new way forward? And episode 8 is about how they execute that way forward. At which point, they have, in some way, shape, or form, achieved what they were trying to achieve in season 1, or perhaps they've realized that the thing that they were trying to achieve in season 1 was never going to get them where they wanted to go, and now season 2 is about the better way. But at any rate, episode 8 stops with their last effort to achieve the goal that they were trying to achieve in episode 8. They've made it unnecessary to pursue that goal any further. And that makes it the end of that particular story. That's the breakdown. Episodes 1 through 8 have now been established. We know what episode 1's about. We know what the protagonist is trying to achieve. So it's time for us to write a pilot summary. Okay? Now there's things that people may ask for, like a cold open or a fifth act, but neither of those things are going to have a huge impact on the story. They have more to do with how the story's marketed and how it's sold to the audience. So don't sweat that right now. You know, fundamentally, that an hour-long episode of television has 4 acts. What are the 4 biggest, most challenging things that your protagonist has to do in order to accomplish their goal for episode 1? What are they trying to achieve in episode 1? What are the 4 biggest things that they actually need to achieve? Now, just like with feature film writing, I'm going to take a minute to mention that we are talking about the efforts of the protagonist here. We're not talking about things that need to happen for them. We're also not talking about things that they need to gather or get that come particularly easily. The audience watches effort. So what we're looking for are the 4 things your protagonist is going to have to do that require the most possible effort from them. Things that are probably not going to work. And so then your protagonist has to go make them work. What are the 4 most challenging, most effortful things your protagonist is going to have to do to realize their goal for episode 1 of your series? Whatever those things are. And by the way, those things shouldn't be artificial. Those things aren't like, you're not building a trap or a maze for your character. You're not building a gauntlet. Well, first they have to pass the swinging blade, and then they have to pass the swinging ball, and then there's a falling floor. No, please don't. Okay? Instead, take an honest look at what your protagonist is trying to achieve in episode 1. Take an honest look at the resources at their disposal, how they're made, how they approach goals, what is going to come naturally to them, and what's going to be more challenging for them. What are the most challenging things for them that anyone would have to do if they were trying to achieve their goal? Or how would this particular character approach this goal, and what would be the hardest parts for them within the context of that? Let them go get the conflict. Don't set things up. Just let them do the thing that they're trying to do their way, and let it be hard for them, because what they're trying to do is inherently overwhelmingly challenging. What are the 4 most challenging things they need to achieve in order to see this goal through? Each of those things is an act. So now, in your summary, you're going to go ahead and write 1 paragraph, 3 sentences, on how your protagonist accomplishes each of those things. So now you have a solid foundation of action through the episode breakdown from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, and you also have a solid foundation of action driving you basically just sketched out through the first episode of the series. So in our next class, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk through writing Act 1, and we're going to break that action down into little pieces so that you can actually start writing scenes. Okay? In the meantime, this week, the goal is to do your episode breakdown and then do your pilot summary. So you have that strong foundation of action. Of course, you're going to start with the log line. You're going to figure out what the episode's actually about. Once you do those three things, we'll meet up next week to write Act 1. Thank you very much for showing up for the right stuff. I'll see you next week. I look forward to learning with you.